Okay, welcome back. My purpose in this video is to review some of the key considerations we've already seen in Spinoza, and then to attempt to link those ideas to Spinoza's complete argument, or as complete as we can make it in a course of this type, for the existence of God, and of course not just God, but the existence of one substance. So if you recall, Spinoza was a monist. In contrast, we've seen Descartes and many other thinkers before and after, like Plato as an example, were dualists. Spinoza wants to say that there is one substance with infinite attributes. However, he says we only grasp two of those attributes, namely thinking and extension. And he identifies this substance with God. Now, if you recall, this is perhaps the trickiest bit with Spinoza, getting clear on the terminology. Spinoza distinguishes between a substance, an attribute, and a mode. So by a substance, he means something that is conceived through itself and exists independently of everything else. So as we saw previously, if we begin to take this definition quite literally, it's rather tough to point to an individual substance that's an authentic substance. So for example, say I consider a tree outside as a substance. Is that really a substance? Well, I can think of the tree kind of existing on its own somewhere, but I can't really conceive it through itself, because if I think about the tree, I automatically begin to think about other things. Well, where is the tree rooted in the ground, and where does it get its water supply from? And how does it produce its chlorophyll? Does it get sunlight? What kind of nutrients does the tree require? Is the tree eternal? Did the tree come from some other tree or some other being? And so slowly but surely we realize that things like trees and other things, whether we think of people or cats or automobiles, these things are not true substances in this sense. Now, some people have pointed out actually that what Spinoza really gives us here then is a univocal, write this word down, and it's quite difficult to type with this program, so just give me a second. That Spinoza is advocating for what's called the univocity of being. He thinks that being is univocal. To say something is univocal is to say that it has really only one meaning. So it's not that we're kind of like substances, right? We're not substances by analogy. It's not like the word substance has two different meanings. So we think of infinite substance and we think of finite substance. That's something that, Descartes could allow. You've got sort of God that's just much greater than us, and then we have us, but we're also substances. Spinoza wants to say that substance only has one meaning and it only applies to God. But there's also another difficulty that we saw, which is, look, if we think about substance at all, what are we actually thinking about? Now, Spinoza likes Descartes' idea that when we think about, physical substances, we are really keying into this attribute, this essential feature of them, which is extension. The real difference between them here is that Spinoza will deny that there are any substances apart from God. So really if he's right, what we're doing when we think about an individual substance like a table or a chair or a tree is we're really only thinking about a particular part of an attribute that is in the essence of God. And I know that sounds very kind of confusing, but maybe as we proceed, this will become a little clearer. And finally, we have the mode. Now, the mode is always conceived through something other than itself. So the way that I look at modes is to say that modes are sort of all the surface details that kind of inhere inside the attributes of things. This is the particular shape something has, the location it has, the color, the species of the tree, and so on. So Spinoza wants to say there is one substance with infinite attributes. An attribute, of course, is what essentially belongs to a substance. So if an acorn were a substance, we could just say, well, it's essentially an extended being. If you get rid of extension, you can't think of something existing in space and time, right? A mode is a modification of an attribute. So maybe when we notice this particular acorn, we notice that it's small, it has a chip on the side, it has a brownish hue to it, and so on. A substance of any sort, of course, cannot be caused by something else. It has to be conceived through itself. So although we can still talk about substance and attribute and mode, pretty soon we'll see that for Spinoza, these terms can only apply to one being and one being alone. That will be God, because only God can be conceived through him, her, or itself. Now, if Spinoza is right, of course, we have something like pantheism, right? That everything is in God, or God is everything. Now, one way that you might start to think about this, and this is not sort of a literal example from Spinoza, but this might be helpful, is if we think of an example of change. You look at the piece of paper on the left, you look at the fire, you look at the paper on fire, and then you look at the ash. According to Descartes, when we see all of these things occur, we only know that the last entity in that sequence is the same as the first, because we have an idea of a substance that is different from its modifications. So it's different than color, shape, size, weight, etc. So there has to be some conservation of being here. If anything, you might say substance is what has those attributes and modes of attributes, or it's what expresses them. That might be a little more accurate. So what exactly must a substance be? What kind of being would be capable of, owning properties and extension and so on? Now, I think in modern terms, we might think about this in terms of matter, or perhaps energy, that can't be created, can't be destroyed, but that everything in the material universe is basically a manifestation of. So you have different forms of it, but ultimately you have one underlying being. So even that little doggy right there, right? That's going to be God. And Wolverine. Now, that's largely review. So now we're going to consider Spinoza's strategy here. Spinoza has to show that two substances cannot have the same attribute. Now, we did look at that argument before our test, but I'm going to review that. Then, he has to show that any substance that exists must be infinite. And then he has to show that there can only be one such infinite substance. And then I suppose you could extend that. You could say, well, why does the infinite substance have to be God? So there's that as well. So two substances cannot have the same attribute. Why is that? Well, what does that mean, first of all? Well, let's say there are two balls. We have a ball here and we have a ball here. Now, are these two substances with the same attribute? On a common sense level, you would say yes, because the attribute is obviously not the color, and it's not the location, and it's not the shape, but it's the fact that it is an extended thing, right? They're both extended. So much like the wax, we could say, well, ball number one, ball number two, the piece of wax, a chair, a book, they're all extended beings. So they have the same essential characteristic, that is extension. So you might think that they have the same attribute and that they're two separate substances. But if they have the same attribute, what would make them different substances? Because remember, the attribute is the thing that gives the essential nature of the thing. Recall that for Spinoza, a substance is only known through its attribute. So if you try to think of a substance, you're going to have to think of an attribute like extension, or an attribute like thinking, or something mental. And those are, of course, only two attributes that you and I know of, right? If God exists, if any infinite substance exists, it would presumably have an infinite array of attributes, but you and I are not clever enough to know all of those. Also recall that a mode, like color, location, size, and so on, is known only through substances, not the reverse. So I can only really understand color or location or size if I already identify those as modes of a substance. Now let's try a little experiment. Assume that X and Y are substances. So we're going to assume that there are two different substances. Then the following seems to obtain. If X and Y had the same attribute, they would be essentially the same. Example, if the two balls have the same attribute, they would basically be essentially the same. If X and Y were essentially the same, they could not be differentiated from one another. If I tried to understand the difference between ball number 1 and ball number 2, I could hardly say ball number 1 is an extended thing. That's what makes ball number 1 ball number 1. And ball number 2 is an extended thing, and that's what makes it different from ball number 1, because I'm just pointing to the same identical attribute to differentiate them. But then if X and Y couldn't be differentiated, they would be identical. And if they were identical, they would be one substance, not two. Hence, X and Y cannot have the same attribute and be two different substances. So you might think of other examples of this. So you and I are presumably, we're all human beings. If the attribute of us were a human being, now it's not, it would be, I guess, extension for Spinoza, but just think about how this logic might work. If I said the thing that makes me me is the fact that I'm a human being, and you said, no, wait a second, I'm a human being, there would have to be some further difference between you and me in virtue of the fact that we could say, I am not you and you are not me. We can't just use an attribute to differentiate us. The difference, of course, with Spinoza is talking about the attribute just as extension, right? He's not thinking about a species like human being or dog or whatever. Now, obviously, substances can only be differentiated from one another through one of two ways. You've got attributes or you've got modes. Because when we try to think of a substance, we automatically begin to think of attributes and modes. Put another way, it doesn't look like we can think of a substance totally in the abstract without having some key concept like an attribute to lock on to. Two substances with the same attribute cannot be differentiated, though, because their attribute will be what they share in common. Now you might say, what about the modes? Well, you can't differentiate two substances by their modes, because these modes can only be known through their substances. You have to know that a ball exists and is a substance first in order to recognize, oh, the reason that ball is different than that other ball is because that ball on the left has one particular color and the ball on the right has a slightly different color. You can only recognize a mode like color or shape or motion or any of these other things because you already know that you're dealing with a substance. So you can't use a mode to understand a substance because modes are conceived not through themselves as substances are, but only through other things, i.e. substance. So if two substances did have the same attribute, they would not be different substances. They'd have to be the same substance. Now the obvious objection which came up in class before was, what if we have two balls that are different because of their spatial locations? it seems perfectly plausible to say that the ball on the left is different than the ball on the right because you have two bits of matter that can't occupy the same space at the same time. And as long as one is in one location and the other is in another location, as long as they're not in the same location, they can't be the same substance. But I think what Spinoza would likely say is that location is actually a mode. So when we think of location 1, as I'll call it, as opposed to location 2, we only identify those as locations of substances. So we need to know that we have a substance to begin with. So I think location in space or in time will work in a similar way to other modes. So to recap, if Spinoza is right, substance must exist, or else we couldn't have any dependent beings, because beings that are dependent can't really depend on other beings and other beings and other beings and other beings, because they would have no explanation for why they exist, unless of course we can explain an infinite series of dependent beings, which is, I suppose, a possibility, but many philosophers have rejected that idea. And by the way, that would be an excellent paper topic. Second point, each substance has its own attribute. You can't have any common attributes. Put another way, two substances with an identical attribute can't exist. Now this also means, though, that the attribute of any given substance must be infinite, okay? So two substances that have no attribute in common cannot limit or otherwise interact with one another. For example, a body can only be limited by another body, not an idea. Imagine that I'm in a jail cell somewhere. I try to leave the jail cell. I can't, because my body is a physical object, and a physical object can be barred from moving in a certain direction by another physical object, like the bars in a cell, or shackles, if they're so mean that they shackle me right to the wall. However, a body can be limited by a body, but an idea can't really be limited by a body. I mean, I could easily, if I'm in the jail cell, I could imagine that I'm someplace else. I could think of Spinoza. I could recite poetry by Goethe or Shakespeare. I could do any number of other things. So you can't limit a thought or an idea by a body. But equally, you can't really limit a body by an idea or a thought. They have nothing in common, right? They're two different attributes. We saw this with Descartes, right? Where the problem of interaction comes about because Descartes says you've got two different things, right? In this case, it's not really two different things so much as two different attributes. Hence, conclusion, the attribute of a substance cannot be limited by the attribute of another substance. So if any attribute is not limited, therefore it has to be unlimited or infinite. So any substance that existed could not be limited by any other substance, because to be limited by another substance, the two substances would have to have something in common. What would they have in common? Well, they would have in common, right, this thing. They'd have to have in common an attribute. But since they don't have a common attribute, there's no way the two substances can sort of butt up against each other. They can't limit one another. Aha. So, if we have substance, and if we have as many substances as might exist, they have to be infinite. But then the question is, how many substances actually exist? And of course, the punchline, as we already know, is Spinoza says, you only get one substance. That's monism. Now, assuming that substances with infinite attributes exist, why does Spinoza insist that there's only one such substance? Now, there are several arguments he gives for this, so let's dig into this a little more deeply. So this argument that I'm going to give you is a version of the ontological argument. We've seen this kind of argument before in Descartes' fifth meditation. You can see earlier versions of an argument very similar to this in St. Anselm of Canterbury. So premise one says God's essence implies existence. If we think of God, we think of a being that has necessary existence. Premise two, nothing whose essence implies existence cannot not exist. Or put another way, anything whose existence implies existence must exist. Or we could say if the essence of X is to exist, X has to exist. Therefore, God necessarily exists. When we looked at Descartes' ontological argument, the way it was expressed was something like, God has all the perfections, and existence is a perfection. Therefore, God must exist, because God can't lack anything. So this is essentially a form of the ontological argument. And Spinoza claims in Axiom 7, and we know that his ethics is divided into things like definitions and axioms and corollaries, that a thing cannot be conceived as non-existing, or that anything that can be conceived as non-existing has an essence that does not involve existence. So if I can think of, say, a can of, pasta sauce, which I have on the desk right in front of me right now. I know you can't see it, but just imagine, right? If that's the case, I mean, I could take this idea and I could imagine, I could think of this thing as not existing. I mean, obviously something exists right now, but I could imagine it didn't have to exist. Nobody had to make it. I could imagine a world in which it ceases to exist. So obviously the essence of that object, the pasta sauce, is such that it doesn't have to exist. But you can't do that, he says, with God. Now, this is after he defined God in definition 6 as an eternal and infinite being. Okay, so that, again, is not entirely unlike what we've seen with other rationalists like Descartes, where he says, by God, I mean a being that is necessary and eternal and independent and a creator and so on. So we have a definition of something, and then we use the definition to prove the existence of God. Now, here's another way that you can look at this. We could say premise one, whatever explains the non-existence of X must be greater than X. Let's suppose, hypothetically, that only finite beings existed, right? So let's say that we just said, hey, this is an assumption or an hypothesis that we're going to make, right? So we'll just say hypothetically, right? So hypothesis. We're going to say, if there were no infinite being, only finite beings would exist. But then if only finite beings existed, and we posit, therefore, that God does not exist, what would that mean? Well, going back to premise one, that would mean that finite beings that do exist are greater than God. And yet, obviously, our concept of God is such that we think God's existence implies, or I should say God's essence implies existence. God is so great that God cannot fail to exist. So that's another way of looking at that same kind of logic. And obviously, as we've seen before, the ontological argument has quite a long and illustrious history, but it also has many distinct, detractors. Going back to St. Anselm, there's Galnillo, who says, if I imagine a perfect island, as that must exist. Then we have Kant, who talks about the notion of existence not being a predicate, right? If I think about existence, it doesn't really add anything to the concept or essence I think of when I think of an object. So if I have an idea of what tomato sauce is or pasta sauce is, and then you say, okay, well, think of that thing existing. Existence doesn't really add anything to the concept of the pasta sauce. So maybe this is a fallacious argument, but the jury, I think, is still out. There are still some philosophers, at the very least, who argue that ontological arguments are respectable arguments. So I'll let you decide. So if God does exist, there can only be one substance, namely God, because God would not only be infinite in one way, God would be infinite in every possible way. So God would be the one substance that has all of these attributes. And that follows from the fact that each substance has a unique infinite attribute, because no substances can share an attribute. And it also follows from the claim that an absolutely infinite being exists. You can't really have God existing and have other substances existing, because then you'd have two substances with the same attribute, right? Because God has every attribute. And in order to avoid having other substances with one of those infinite attributes, you can't have anything other than God. Okay, so here are some implications of Spinoza's views. And there's actually going to be more in this attempt to delve into Spinoza's philosophy, but because we're going to be doing a discussion this coming week on some of this stuff, I will not be releasing that part of the lecture until the end of the week. But to get us started, just think about the following. Everything is either an attribute or a mode of God. So let's just say that that's pantheism. I told you guys before there is something known as the Pantheismusstreit, right? The pantheism fight, which occurred after Spinoza, principally in Germany, where there were a number of people who thought that Spinoza's philosophy was the most coherent philosophy that you could come up with, but that was a problem because many people thought Spinoza was essentially an atheist because he divinized nature, right? That everything was God. And in point of fact, when he talks about God, sometimes he uses the word nature interchangeably. Now you could imagine nowadays, right, walking into, say, a house of worship somewhere and saying, well, obviously God exists because energy exists, and energy is all around us, and we're sort of all modes in the kind of energy surging through the cosmos, and that's what we mean by God. I don't know what the reaction might be, but I suspect that many people with traditional views of God would likely say that's not quite what we mean by God. Maybe God created the energy, but that's not, God is separate from that. And Spinoza's God is not really separate from the world. So we have this Plato here, right, which is actually Plato fashioned into the shape of, I guess it's supposed to be the philosopher Plato's face. Now, if you think about this, you could say everything in the universe is kind of like a giant Plato. And the benefit of Plato, which is, I think, why children love it so much. Actually, I'm an adult, and I like Plato, right? It's cool to fashion different things with it. There are infinite possibilities with it. You can make it into anything. So you could think God is the substance out of which everything else is sort of constructed. Second problem, and I think this is a huge deal for modern science, or I should say contemporary science. The problem of interaction is resolved. If there's only one substance, there's no issue of explaining how two different substances, mind and body, interact. And strictly speaking, it's not that a mental event causes a physical one or vice versa. It's rather that one substance manifests itself or is known through an infinite number of attributes in modes, which include mind and matter. So, for an example, if I decided right now to get up out of my chair and to stand up, if I did that, I might first have an intention to do that. So I might think, oh, I have to stretch. So I'm going to stand up. So there's some mental thing going on that leads my body to move. So it's perfectly natural for me to say that my thought caused my body to move. And if I get up and I bang my foot on something and it hurts, it's perfectly natural to say that hitting my foot, a physical thing, caused pain receptors to produce some mental state inside me, inside my thinking substance, that I identify with pain. But if you think about that, that's kind of odd, right? Because we can only make sense of that sort of interaction if we think that two different substances with nothing in common actually exist. But since we can't have two substances that exist, and we certainly can't have two substances with the same attribute, right? To get around this problem of interaction, as Spinoza seems to have done, we'd have to say, well, it's rather the case that you and I are not substances at all. We're just sort of modes that are kind of grafted onto attributes of extension and thinking that happen to be in the essence of God. So from the inside, when we look at our thoughts, it seems as though our thoughts are causing our bodies to act in a certain way. And from the outside, it seems like our bodies are causing our mental life to be stimulated in a certain way. But rather, these two things are kind of happening in parallel with one another. They're not really causing each other to happen. So we're looking at these things through a kind of, dual sort of perspective or dual aspect. So you have an idea, which is represented by the cartoon symbol of a light bulb, and you have a brain. And we naturally think of an idea causing things to happen in the brain, and we think of the brain or the body causing things to happen in our mental life. And so we have this guy right here, and, we're thinking, what's the connection between these two things? Well, these two things are actually just attributes, right? Or I should say they're modes, they're expressions of modes in these different attributes of thinking and extension, right, in the mind of God. That's right. So this guy has this idea, hey, I will get a taco. And of course, that idea is what, right? Is that his own idea that he came up with on his own? No, that's actually just an idea mode, if you will, right, in the attribute of thinking inside his mind. And if he then goes and he leaves his computer and he goes and he buys a taco or he makes a meal or whatever, so there's a physical reaction in the environment, again, that's not really his causal power doing that so much as that's God. This makes us hungry, doesn't it, right? Now, another idea, since everything is either an attribute or a mode of God, the natural question is, do we have free will? This is one of the questions that I have for our discussion. Spinoza suggests that if you imagine a stone that is kind of chucked into the air, that if the stone in the middle of its flight through the air all of a sudden became conscious, it might think, I don't know if I want to fly, right? Or maybe I do like to fly. Yeah, this is feeling actually pretty cool, right? But I mean, if the stone thought that it had the power of making some decision and changing its trajectory, that would be foolish, right? Because natural laws really dictate otherwise. The question you have to ask yourself is, if everything is God, and we're just modes in God, and we're not really substances ourselves, because there's only one univocal substance, are we significantly different from the stone? Are we actually responsible for our actions? And if we're not, then how does that actually relate to the title of Spinoza's work, right? The Ethics. Okay, so I think I will stop our discussion right here for the time being. This should give you enough information which, in conjunction with the Thompson book, should allow you to be able to get started on the discussion this coming week. I hope you enjoyed this, but please, I know this is very, very weighty material, so email me, visit me in my office hours, and so on when you have questions. Thank you.